we just looked at order by, and we saw that when we use it, it causes strange things to happen. And those strange things have to do with something we call framing in window functions. When you're trying to get deterministic results with your window function, and you throw order by into the mix, it may completely change the outcome of what you were originally doing. And that has to do with something we call framing. When using a frame clause in a window function, we can create a subrange or frame. A subrange or frame, what does that mean? Well, when we look at our data, when we visualize our data inside our mind, when we use partition by, we are basically creating chunks. We're saying, hey, when I get my window back, when I get my entirety of my data back that I'm going to look at, we're saying, hey, create chunks of the employee number. Let's run something against those chunks, or we'll create chunks against another field. But let's take employee number, for example. When we create a chunk against the employee number, we're basically saying, hey, just group these all together with the partition by. Just group these, and then we can do something with it. And then it stands to reason when we use count that we are getting all of these 17s here, because it goes all the way up to 17. So we're grouping these together logically, and we've created that frame. But when we use order by, we're changing the lens at which we look at the frame. Now, that's an interesting concept, because when we talk about framing, what we're talking about is the way that the window function interprets what it should do against the data. Now, framing comes with a very specific syntax, a syntax that we haven't looked at yet. And when we look at it, we can say rows or range, whether or not you want to use a range or rows as a frame. We can use something called preceding, take all of the rows before the current one. We can use something like following, use all of the rows after the current one. And then we can do something like unbounded preceding or following. Return all before or all after. And then we can say something like current row, your current row. And when we throw that all together, what we can do is we can say something like, hey, create a partition by the category. So group all of my categories together. Then order it by price. And take that range of data that I just gave you from this. And look at everything that came before and the current row. So look at everything that came before and the current row. This becomes very complex, and you have to play around with window functions to really understand the nuances with which you can combine partitions and orders and ranges and framing to get the results that you want. But what we're basically saying here is that when we use order by, we are changing the frame. We're changing the frame of reference. And when we look at a frame clause, well, if you don't use order by default, the frame we look at is usually the entire partition. And if you just used over without anything in it, the entire partition is the entire window, correct? We saw that when you used over, we were running the calculation against all of the data. When we use it without order by, if we use the partition by, it's against all of the partition rows. But when we introduce order by, when we add it into the function, what we're saying is that by default, when you add order by into the mix, the framing is usually everything before the row. So everything before that current row, all of the rows that came before that current row, and the current row. So let's put that to practice. If we're saying that it is everything before the current row and the current row, if we order by employee number, what we're going to see happen here is we're going to see something along the lines in math, what we call a cumulative sum, where we're taking everything that came before. So in this case, this is our very first record, employee 10,001. And if we go down and we look, he's going all the way to 17. So 17 is the number. So we've counted 17. But then if we go to 10,002, we can see that it is 23. So if we see to where 10,002 goes, it goes all the way to 23. So 6 records. 17 to 23, that's 6 records. And you can see that it counted 23. So it is cumulatively counting everything that came before with everything that comes after. And this is extremely special. And this is because we ordered by employee number. Because we ordered by employee number, it is counting everything that it comes across when it counts that specific employee number, the amount of times it occurs, basically, and then it's adding that to the previous sum. All right, so that makes sense. We know now that it's taking everything before it into account and itself. What if we apply it to a partition by? What would happen then? Well, it depends on the partition you're going to do. If we said partition by employee number, what would happen if we do that? Well, because we said that order by with a partition is going to look solely inside of that partition, well, we can know now that it is going to act as if it was a normal partition by. So it's only going to count the 6. It's not going to add it to the previous because it's not taking into account anything that was in that previous partition. But let's say that we ordered by salary. What would happen then? What would happen if we ordered by salary? Well, let's see what happens if we partition by the employee number, but then order by the salary. Will that affect anything? And here we go. Because we're ordering by the salary now, but we're partitioning by the employee number, our partition is the employee number. But our order is the salary. And because they are unique values, now suddenly it's going to look at itself and what came before it, and it's going to add. And because all of these values are unique, because you didn't move forward with the same salary, you're going to go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, that being said, if these values did align, if you did move in position but didn't get a salary bump, we may see the same number occur. Now, it stands to reason that usually when your salary changes in the salary table, it's either going up or down. So the number is going to keep counting forward. But the unique thing that we're talking about here is that the way that you partition and the way that you order really influence each other. When we partitioned by employee number, we were taking into account this entire group. But when we look at the order, it changes the way that we're going to look at that partition. It changes the way that our function is going to interact with that data. Our count is now cumulative, right? It's taking into account the previous and the current. So it's very important to know how framing will change when you introduce an order by. It completely changes the way that the function may interact. Deterministic results you may have gotten when you ran a partition can completely change when you introduce an order by. And that's because the way you look at the frame changes. And it's extremely interesting that this type of syntax is used to change the way that the interaction of the window function works, because it is a bit non-intuitive, right? It's harder to read. It's harder to comprehend what exactly is happening. But when you understand the rules around the framing, it can become extremely intuitive as you use it more and more. Now, none of us are going to become window function masters overnight. You have to use it on a daily basis and grind through it and really start to understand the nuances of the different functions and the different framing and all of that. But we're going to give you a hell of a solid basis. Now, with all of that said, we kind of looked at the way that the partition and the way the order works. And we can see now that the order works in a way that it is only taking into account the current frame and the previous, the current and the previous. Now, what if we wanted to change that? Well, we can do that, and we can say range between And then we can say, okay, take the range that I have, these employee numbers, but range it between unbounded preceding and unbounded following. So instead of you taking into account, hey, all of the previous ones and the current one, take everything into account before and after. And so what's going to happen here, as we see while we execute this, is we're again changing the way that the count is going to work. We're changing the way of the outcome. And now it looks more like what we originally saw, which was the same that the partition did, taking into account the entire partition, taking into account that whole partition is extremely important. Now, what if we used rows instead? Because that was also a keyword we saw, right? What would that do? Well, that's a good question. Let's see what that would do. And so playing around with this, we can kind of see that, hey, when we use partition and order, the way that we can define our range is within that partition. And the order by influences the way that we look at that frame. But then we can also change the way that we look at that frame. And if we look here, we can see that rows or range didn't really affect anything in this specific partition because we are partitioning. So there are a lot of nuances. There are a lot of things you can play around with here to kind of see how it plays around with your data. And I find count to be an extremely helpful thing to see, hey, what exactly is going on in this range? What exactly is going on in this partition? What exactly is order by doing to my frame? And with all of that, what we get is the ability to run countless types of functions, averages, sums. We can pluck the last value, the first value. We can do a lot of different things. We can get the positioning. Framing is important in window functions, and it can become extremely important when you're doing data analysis. Because, again, order by can take whatever deterministic result you had in your partition and completely change it because it changes the way that the function is going to look at the data. It's going to take into account the current and the previous. So the current and the previous. Whereas with the partition, you're taking into account the entire partition. So framing is important. And you can change the framing of the partition by using something like range between unbounded preceding and current row. You can do that. You can change the way without having to use order by, and you can still make it operate as if you were using an order by. And that is an extremely interesting concept, because if we did range between unbounded preceding and current row, what we're going to see here is it did absolutely nothing. Now, if we took rows and we did that instead, because we were using range, we used the entire range. Now, if we use rows, we can see that it's operating as if it was using an order by. So, as you could see, the way that you interact with the framing is important. Am I going to take into account rows, or am I going to take into account the range? Am I going to use an order by, and do I have to change the way that we look at the frame? Playing around with this can be extremely useful to wrap your head around, hey, what exactly is going on here? Because this is an extremely intricate concept, an extremely difficult concept to grasp on the first go. And through exercises, I believe that everyone can master the basics and become advanced at this concept over time. So let's look at some examples to make us advanced.